Hello there, and welcome to the weekly Outside Views magazine on American politics. According to US media reports, Twitter has blocked the accounts of at least 6 prominent journalists. Among others, employees of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the broadcaster CNN are affected. The closure took place on Thursday evening, and that without warning, wrote the Washington Post. Just the day before, Twitter had blocked an account that was following the private jet of CEO Elon Musk. Some of the now suspended journalists have reportedly written about Musk's comments that he and his family were put at risk by sharing local data. Before their ban, many of the journalists had tens of thousands of followers on the platform. That is something the New York Times wrote. Several US media reported that Twitter initially did not respond to requests for a direct statement. In several tweets on Friday night, however, Musk wrote that the same rule applies to journalists as to everyone else. He was referring to doxing, which is the disclosure of an individual's personal documents, including information such as their address. You posted my real-time exact location, basically the coordinates for an assassination attempt, is what Musk wrote, without providing details or evidence. Musk spoke of a violation of the Twitter terms of use. It was initially unclear whether the accounts were permanently blocked. Today's suspension of the Twitter accounts of a number of prominent journalists, including Ryan Mack of the New York Times, is questionable and unfortunate, said newspaper spokesman Charlie Stadlander on Thursday evening. Twitter gave no explanation for the move. It is hoped that the bans will be lifted. The impulsive and unwarranted suspension of a number of reporters, including CNN's Donny O'Sullivan, is worrying but not surprising, CNN wrote. The Twitter account that followed Musk's private jet was created by student Jack Sweeney, who used an automated computer bot to analyze publicly available flight data. Musk had stated in a tweet on Wednesday evening that he deactivated bot accounts that violated the internet platform's users' guidelines. The Twitter boss announced in November that he was so committed to freedom of speech that he allowed the account, even though it posed a risk to his security. And suddenly, a change of mind. Radical supporters of ousted Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro have tried to break into the federal police building in the capital, Brasilia. This was reported by the news agency Agência Brasil, citing the militarized police on Monday evening. Accordingly, they protested against the provisional arrest warrant for an indigenous Bolsonaro supporter and set fire to cars and buses. There were clashes with the police, who used tear gas in response. Right-wing Bolsonaro narrowly lost to left-wing former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in the runoff election for the presidency in Latin America's largest country at the end of October. Many of his supporters, unwilling to accept Lula's election victory, are demonstrating against it in different parts of Brazil. Reminds me of the USA, by the way. Because they suspect fraud because of the close election result, they repeatedly call for military intervention. Trump training, obviously. The Supreme Electoral Authority certified Lula's election in a ceremony in Brasilia on Monday, allowing him to take office on January 1st. He received a corresponding certificate. The United States is expanding its training program for Ukrainian soldiers. Defense Department spokesman Pat Ryder announced in Washington on Thursday that the training, which has so far been focused on the use of weapons, will be supplemented by maneuvers. In the future, the training will include units for 400 Ukrainian soldiers every month, also as a supplement to programs from the EU and Great Britain. The exercises should therefore take place at training places in Germany. According to the US Department of Defense, the United States has provided more than $19 billion in military aid to Ukraine since Russia's war of aggression began in late February. After increasingly violent protests over the ousting of President Pedro Castillo, the Peruvian Congress has rejected a bill calling for early parliamentary and presidential elections. The bill did not get the support it needed, Congress announced on Thursday. Dina Boluarte, successor to the deposed Castillo, had initially aimed for early elections in April 2024 instead of the regular date of 2026. In view of the precarious security situation, Boluarte then indicated December 23 as a possible new date. By dissolving the Congress, the left-wing politician Castillo wanted to forestall a vote of no confidence in Parliament last week. His cabinet and the opposition accused him of a coup, and Castillo was removed from office, arrested and held in custody for 7 days. On Thursday, the court ordered Castillo to be held in custody for an additional 18 months, while law enforcement officials investigate him on charges of rebellion. In southern and southeastern Peru, where Castillo has a particularly large number of supporters in rural areas, but also in the capital Lima, there have been protests against his dismissal and clashes between demonstrators and the police for about a week. The Boluarte government declared a 30-day state of emergency across the country and declared a 5-day night curfew in 15 provinces. At least 15 people were killed in clashes, that's what the Ombudsman's office said on Thursday. Another 5 people died in traffic accidents and other incidents related to road blockades. Education Minister Patricia Correa and Culture Minister Jair Perez resigned over the deaths in the protests. Air and train traffic has been suspended in parts of the Andes, and according to Peruvian media reports, hundreds of tourists have been stuck. Thousands of demonstrators are demanding the resignation of Castillo's successor Boluarte, the dissolution of parliament, early new elections, and the release of the imprisoned ex-president. South American Guyana has launched a tender to develop more than a dozen new oil and gas fields in the sea of the country's coast. The bidding round for the 14 fields is now underway, said Guyanese President Irfan Ali in a Facebook video on Friday. It is hoped that orders will be placed by the end of May. Of course, the award will be made after negotiations and evaluation of the offers, they said. A consortium led by ExxonMobil found a lot of oil off the coast of the 800,000 inhabitant state in 2015. Guyana is one of the poorest countries in South America, though. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has predicted economic growth of almost 86% for Venezuela's neighbor before the pandemic. According to estimates, revenues from the oil business could bring the state around 10 billion euros into the coffers by 2030. According to the agreement between the government and ExxonMobil, 75% of oil revenues would initially go to the company to cover costs and 25% to the state. The opposition at the time had criticized this in the 2020 election campaign because it would greatly benefit ExxonMobil. Opposition candidate Ali emerged victorious in the 2020 election in the former British colony. The electorate in Guyana was split between Afro-Guyanese, descendants of African slaves, and Indo-Guyanese, descendant of Indian workers. Ali is Indo-Guyanese. Russia has warned the United States not to supply Ukraine with Patriot-type anti-aircraft weapons. If such reports are confirmed, it would be another provocative step by the United States. That's what State Department spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said in Moscow on Thursday. The United States would thus allow itself to be drawn ever deeper into the conflict with all the ensuing consequences. Zakharova also announced that Patriot missiles would be targeted by the Russian army as a priority target. Russia has been waging a war of aggression against neighboring Ukraine since the end of February. 3 months after the failed constitutional referendum in Chile, the political camps in the South American country have agreed on a new constitutional process. Representatives of the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies presented a document on Monday evening that defines the body and the schedule for the drafting of a new basic law or constitution. It was agreed that a constitutional process was essential according to the paper entitled Agreement for Chile. Unlike the previous attempt when all members of the Constituent Assembly were elected, this time a mixed committee of freely elected experts and experts appointed by Parliament is to work out the new draft. As before, this should be made up of equal numbers of women and men. That's at least what the paper said. Seats are also reserved for indigenous people. A first draft will then be presented in October 2023, which will be voted on at the end of November, it said. A new constitution was one of the core demands of the demonstrators who took to the streets in their thousands against the government at the end of 2019. In a vote in September, the Chileans rejected a newly drafted text by a large majority. For many, the progressive design probably went too far. Chile thus retained its current constitution, which dates from the time of the military dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet, that was from 1973 to 1990. Critics complain that the constitution codifies the neoliberal economic system, makes far-reaching changes in the law more difficult due to high quorums, and hardly guarantees basic social rights. In view of the food crisis in parts of Africa, the United States want to enter into a strategic partnership with the African Union. We are joining forces to create a more resilient food system and improve the way communities grow, sell, and buy their own food, said US President Joe Biden on Thursday at the end of a summit with African leaders and heads of government in Washington. This also includes investments in infrastructure that promote sustainable food security, as well as improvements in irrigation or grain storage. It is also working with the private sector to expand investment in fertilizers, among other things. The effects of the corona pandemic, the climate crisis, rising energy prices and conflicts, above all the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, had interrupted global supply chains and caused global food prices to rise drastically. The Ukraine war and blocked shipments of millions of tons of grain have further increased the risk of famine in the Horn of Africa. In Somalia in particular, millions of people are at risk of starvation because of an unprecedented drought. In the United States, the number of weekly initial jobless claims fell unexpectedly, indicating an improving situation on the labor market. Their number fell by 20,000 to 211,000. That's what the Department of Labor announced in Washington on Thursday. Analysts, however, had expected a slight increase in aid applications to 232,000. The level of requests for assistance shows that the situation on the labor market remains robust. The initial applications for unemployment benefits are considered an indicator of the short-term development of the labor market. Despite a weaker economy in the USA, many companies have been complaining about a shortage of workers for months. The most recent labor market report for November was also robust. The US Federal Reserve bases its monetary policy heavily on the development of the job market. It is trying to get the very high inflation under control by raising interest rates sharply. Most recently, however, it has slowed the pace of interest rate hikes so as not to put too much strain on the economy. And this concludes this week's magazine on American politics, but of course tomorrow you'll see my next video, and I'll see you there. I'll be back.